Picture this. You're a hunter-gatherer, 40,000 years ago, and you just watched your brother-in-law get his leg mangled by a wild boar that clearly had a personal vendetta against him. No hospitals, no painkillers, no YouTube tutorials on how to set a broken femur with sticks and prayer. Just you, a screaming man, and a group of very stressed out people staring at each other like, okay, now what? Here's the twist nobody tells you about prehistoric life. The person most likely to save that guy wasn't the strongest hunter. It wasn't the fastest runner. It wasn't even the guy who could throw a spear through a mammoth's eye socket from 50 paces. It was probably some old woman sitting by the fire, half-blind, with maybe 4 teeth left, who had seen this exact injury 40 years earlier and knew exactly what herbs to chew into a paste. Grandma just saved the day. Again. And that, right there, is the secret weapon that got our species through the worst that prehistory could throw at us. Not muscles, not tools, not even fire, really. It was grandparents. Old, creaky, allegedly useless grandparents. And today we're going to talk about why early humans absolutely could not have made it without them, why evolution itself seems to agree with us, and why, honestly, we probably owe our entire existence as a species to a bunch of cranky old people who refuse to stop being useful. Let's start with a question that sounds almost insulting when you say it out loud. Why do humans even have grandparents? I mean, biologically speaking, most animals don't. A salmon does its one heroic swim upstream, spawns, and dies before its kids even hatch. It doesn't stick around to give advice. It doesn't get a chance to babysit. A chimpanzee mother can expect to live long enough to raise her own offspring, sure, but she's rarely still kicking around by the time her grandkids show up. Nature, in general, is not sentimental. Once you've done your reproductive duty, nature tends to treat you like a phone that's out of warranty. No updates, no support. Thanks for your service. Please exit the gene pool. Humans broke that rule. Hard. Somewhere in our evolutionary past, something bizarre happened. Human females developed something called menopause, a hard stop on reproduction that happens decades before the rest of the body gives up. That's genuinely strange in the animal kingdom. Why would evolution turn off reproduction while a body still has years, sometimes decades, of life left in the tank? If the entire game of evolution is pass on your genes, then a postmenopausal woman should, in theory, be evolutionary dead weight. She can't have more kids. She's not adding new genetic material to the population. Case closed, right? Except evolution doesn't just look at whether an individual reproduces. It looks at whether an individual's genes survive and spread, and it turns out there's more than one way to do that. This is where anthropologists cooked up something called the grandmother hypothesis, and once you hear it, it's kind of hard to unhear. The idea goes like this. A woman who stops being able to have her own children can instead pour all of that time, energy, and hard-earned wisdom into helping her existing children and grandchildren survive. Instead of gambling on one more risky pregnancy at, say, age 45 in an environment with zero modern medicine, she becomes a force multiplier for the family she already has. She gathers food. She watches toddlers. She knows which berries will feed you and which ones will make you regret ever being born. In doing so, she boosts the survival odds of children who already share half her genes and grandchildren who share a quarter. Suddenly, sticking around and not reproducing is the smarter genetic bet. Grandma isn't retired. Grandma is playing a completely different and arguably smarter game than everybody else at the table, and prehistoric humans needed that kind of backup badly because human childhood is, frankly, an evolutionary disaster waiting to happen. Think about it this way. A baby gorilla can cling to its mother's fur within days of being born and is reasonably self-sufficient within a few years. A baby elephant is up and stumbling around within 20 minutes of birth, which, frankly, feels unfair. A human baby, on the other hand, can't even hold its own head up for months, can't walk properly until it's over a year old, and doesn't become anything close to self-sufficient until somewhere around age 12 to 15. That is an enormous, dangerous window of total dependency. For over a decade, a human child is basically a very cute, very loud liability that needs constant feeding, constant protection, and constant supervision. Or it will absolutely wander directly into a river, a fire, or the open jaws of something with way too many teeth. Now imagine you're a prehistoric mother. You've got one toddler who needs to be watched every second so he doesn't eat a poisonous mushroom, and you're also nursing a newborn. And also, this is prehistory. Remember? You still need to go find food because nobody invented supermarkets yet, and the nearest edible bush is a 40-minute walk away and might be occupied by something hungry. This is what anthropologists sometimes call the juggling problem of early human motherhood. Too many dependent kids, too little time, and only two hands. Mathematically, something has to break. This is exactly the gap that grandparents filled. While mom was off gathering roots and berries or helping process a kill, grandma or grandpa could watch the older kids, keep the toddler from testing whether fire is edible, and basically run a full-time prehistoric daycare. Except the daycare workers here had decades of survival knowledge instead of a laminated activity chart and a box of crayons. This childcare support didn't just make life easier. Multiple studies on modern hunter-gatherer societies, like the Hadza in Tanzania, have shown that children with actively involved grandmothers had noticeably better survival rates and often grew up healthier and better nourished. When grandma was around and helping out, kids were more likely to make it to adulthood. When she wasn't, the odds got measurably worse. That's not folklore. That's actual field research from anthropologists watching real, modern-day hunter-gatherer communities, taking notes, and presumably being fed very well by grandmothers who insisted the researchers looked too thin. So right there, you've already got two massive reasons early humans needed grandparents. Extra hands for childcare, and extra calories brought in by grandma still being an active food gatherer well into old age. In fact, research on the Hadza found that older women were often among the most efficient tuber diggers in the entire group, sometimes outproducing younger women because efficient digging is less about raw strength and more about knowing exactly where to dig, which only comes with decades of practice. So while everyone assumes grandma slowed down, in some cases grandma was quietly out hustling everybody and just not making a big deal about it. But honestly, the childcare and calories combo is only the opening act. The real showstopper is what was sitting inside those old, wrinkly skulls. Information. Specifically, information that could mean the difference between "we survived this winter" and "we do not." Let's talk about something that sounds boring on paper but was in practice a life-or-death encyclopedia. Knowing which plants will kill you. Here's a fun, slightly horrifying fact. A huge number of edible-looking plants in the wild have toxic lookalikes. Certain wild mushrooms can look nearly identical to their edible cousins while being perfectly capable of shutting down your liver. Certain berries look delicious right up until they cause seizures. In a world with no labels, no internet, and no poison control hotline, the only database available was, does anyone here remember what happened the last time someone ate this? And who was most likely to remember? Not the 25-year-old hunter who was busy chasing gazelles and thinking about his own reputation. It was the 60-year-old who had personally watched 3 different berry-related medical emergencies over the decades and had made mental notes each time, usually while also thinking, I told them not to eat that. Every elder in a prehistoric band was essentially a walking, talking survival manual, except this manual had actually been field tested through decades of trial, error, and occasionally near-death experiences. You couldn't download that knowledge. You couldn't Google, is this mushroom poisonous? You needed a living person who had already made and survived the mistake, so you didn't have to. This wasn't limited to food either. Old age in prehistory meant you had lived through things the younger generation simply had not. Maybe you were a kid the last time there was a truly brutal, multi-year drought, and you remembered which watering holes never dried up even when everything else did. Maybe you remembered a flood, decades earlier, that wiped out a camp built too close to a river, and you made sure your grandkids' camp went up on higher ground instead, probably while muttering, some of us remember what happened last time. Maybe you remembered which valley the predators avoided, or which route through the mountains didn't turn deadly once winter hit, or which neighboring group could actually be trusted and which one you absolutely did not want to run into after dark. Modern researchers actually have a name for this kind of knowledge. It's sometimes called ecological or environmental memory, and it becomes disproportionately valuable exactly in the moments when things go wrong, in ways nobody currently alive has personally experienced. A rare flood, a once-in-a-generation drought, a predator that hasn't been spotted in the area for decades but suddenly returns. Younger group members might have zero frame of reference for these events. Elders, especially those who had survived multiple rare disasters over a long life, were often the only ones who did. In small hunter-gatherer bands, that stored memory could be the difference between adapting in time and simply not making it through the season. Think of it as a prehistoric insurance policy, except the payout was, you don't starve, and the paperwork was just listening to an old man talk for 20 minutes. There's actually a broader theory built around exactly this idea, sometimes discussed under the term the grandmother effect in evolutionary biology, though the underlying concept stretches even further than childcare. It's the notion that long-lived elders essentially functioned as a society's memory bank. storing decades of hard-won environmental and survival knowledge that younger members hadn't yet had time to accumulate themselves. And when you're living in small bands with no written language, no libraries, and definitely no cloud storage, that living memory bank was quite literally irreplaceable. Lose the elder, lose the information. There's no backup copy, no cloud sync, no "did you save that before he died" moment. Once it's gone, an entire lifetime of hard-earned lessons just vanishes. Now, here's the part that a lot of people forget when they picture prehistoric humans as basically brainless cavemen grunting at each other. This knowledge sharing wasn't happening through boring lectures. It was happening through stories. Anthropologists studying modern hunter-gatherer groups have found something genuinely fascinating. Storytelling around the fire wasn't just entertainment to pass the time before bed. It was one of the primary ways that survival knowledge, social rules, and cultural values got transmitted from one generation to the next. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. And who tends to do most of the storytelling in these communities? Overwhelmingly, it's the older members of the group. The same elders who had the most life experience to draw from, and, frankly, the most time on their hands since they weren't out chasing antelope anymore. Researchers studying groups like the Jew Huanxie in southern Africa found that a huge chunk of nighttime conversation, especially stories told by older members, was directly about social knowledge. Who did what? Who you can trust? What happened to that one guy who broke the rules? What happened during the bad years? This wasn't idle gossip, it was essentially prehistoric social programming, teaching kids how to navigate group life, who to cooperate with, and what values the community actually cared about, wrapped up in narratives interesting enough that kids would actually want to listen. Basically, Grandpa wasn't just cute for telling stories by the fire. Grandpa was running the most important curriculum in the entire camp. And he didn't even need a whiteboard, a syllabus, or a school building. Just a fire, some patience, and an audience of children who were legally required to sit still because there was nowhere else to go. And look, we shouldn't pretend all of this knowledge transfer was some perfectly noble, purely altruistic gift either. There was a practical trade happening here too. Elders who could no longer hunt effectively or travel long distances still needed to justify their food share and their spot in the group. In a world with limited resources, an unproductive mouth to feed is a real cost. So elders leaned hard into the roles where their experience actually outweighed their declining physical strength. Teaching, mediating group disputes, remembering history, tracking who owed favors to whom, and yes, telling really good stories. It was, in a sense, one of the earliest forms of a division of labor by age. Young, strong bodies did the hunting and the heavy lifting. Older, wiser minds did the thinking, the remembering, and the social glue. Both were essential. Neither could really replace the other. Try asking a 22-year-old hunter to remember 30 years of drought patterns, and try asking a 70-year-old to sprint down a gazelle. Neither one is winning that trade. Speaking of social glue, let's talk about something else grandparents were unexpectedly crucial for: keeping the peace. Small hunter-gatherer bands lived in incredibly close quarters, essentially forever. There was no going home to your own place after an argument. You saw the same 15 to 30 people every single day for your entire life. If a serious conflict broke out and there was no mechanism to resolve it, that band could genuinely fracture. And fracturing in prehistory wasn't just an inconvenience, it could be a death sentence. Fewer hunters, fewer gatherers, fewer eyes watching for danger. Splitting a group could turn a manageable population into one too small to reliably survive predators, disease, or a bad season. Elders frequently served as the natural mediators in these situations, and it makes sense why. They usually weren't personally competing for status, mates, or hunting glory anymore, so they had less skin in the game and could be seen as relatively neutral. They also had decades of accumulated social history, remembering old debts, old favors, old grudges, and old resolutions, which let them settle disputes with actual context instead of just picking a side based on who yelled louder. Imagine an argument breaking out over who got the bigger share of a kill, and Grandpa calmly pointing out that this exact fight happened 15 years ago. And here's how it got resolved then. And everyone begrudgingly agrees because arguing with someone who's been alive since before your parents met is somehow exhausting in a way that shuts the whole thing down. In many small-scale societies studied by anthropologists today, elders still play exactly this role. The calm, respected voice that steps in when tempers flare, precisely because they've watched this exact type of argument play out a dozen times before and know how it usually gets resolved without anyone storming off into the wilderness forever. Now let's bring this all together, because at this point you might be wondering, okay, but did grandparents actually change human evolution, or is this just a nice story we tell ourselves? Turns out the evidence for real evolutionary impact is pretty compelling. Remember that dependency window we talked about earlier, the 10+ years it takes for a human child to become self-sufficient. Researchers argue that this extraordinarily long childhood, one of the longest in the entire animal kingdom, was only survivable in the first place because of extra caregivers beyond just the mother. This idea has a name too: cooperative breeding, or sometimes alloparenting, which is the fancy scientific term for "it takes a village." Except the village in question was mostly grandma, plus maybe an aunt or an older sibling who got roped into babysitting duty whether they liked it or not. Human children needed so much investment for so long that a single mother, even with a supportive partner, likely couldn't have provided enough calories, protection, and supervision alone. Add grandparents into the equation, and suddenly that impossibly long, brain-heavy childhood becomes survivable, and even advantageous because more time to grow up means more time to learn all that complex tool use, language, and social behavior that eventually made humans the dominant species on the planet. Here's the wild part. Some researchers connect this directly to why human brains got so big in the first place. Big brains are expensive. They take enormous amounts of energy and an enormous amount of time to develop fully. A human brain in particular burns through a huge chunk of the body's total energy just idling, doing nothing dramatic, just existing. A species can only afford an expensive, slow-developing brain if it can guarantee the resources and protection to keep that developing brain alive long enough to actually pay off. Grandparents, by extending the safety net around children, may have literally helped make room for evolution to gamble on bigger, slower developing, more complex brains. Which, if that theory holds, means the eccentric aunt who tells the same 3 stories every holiday, and the grandfather who insists on explaining how he fixed a fence 40 years ago, might, evolutionarily speaking, be part of the reason you're capable of reading this sentence at all. It's a strange thought, honestly. Every time you've rolled your eyes at a grandparent repeating a story you've already heard 12 times, you might have been rolling your eyes at the exact mechanism that allowed your species to develop language, complex tools, and the ability to roll your eyes in the first place. Of course, none of this means every single grandparent throughout prehistory was some flawless font of wisdom and childcare. Some were probably grumpy. Some probably gave terrible advice about which mushrooms were safe. Some were probably the prehistoric equivalent of the uncle who insists his home remedy works better than anything a doctor could offer. Evolution doesn't require perfection, just a strong enough average benefit over countless generations. But the pattern holds up across cultures, across continents, and across thousands of years of anthropological research. Groups with active, involved elders tended to do better. Children survived more often. Knowledge got passed down more reliably. Social conflicts got resolved before they became fatal. Camps that lost their elders too early, whether through disease, disaster, or simple bad luck, often struggled in ways that groups with intact elder generations simply didn't. There's also something worth noting about how this shaped human societies more broadly, beyond just the immediate family unit. In many hunter-gatherer cultures, respect for elders wasn't just a nice cultural value tacked on for politeness, it was functional. Groups that valued and protected their older members were, in a very real sense, protecting their own long-term survival odds. A band that let its elders starve first during a food shortage was a band actively destroying its own knowledge base. A band that prioritized keeping its elders fed and safe, even when they could no longer hunt or travel as fast, was investing in a resource that couldn't be replaced any other way. This might be part of why so many human cultures across totally unconnected parts of the world independently developed strong traditions of elder respect. It wasn't just sentimentality, it was, in a roundabout way, extremely practical. So the next time someone jokes about grandparents being obsolete, now that we have search engines and hospitals, remember this. For the vast majority of human history, grandparents weren't a nice bonus. They were core infrastructure. They were the daycare, the emergency room, the search engine, the peacekeeping force, and the entire education system all rolled into one slightly hunched, extremely opinionated package. Take away the grandparents from a prehistoric band, and you weren't just losing a beloved family member. You were losing your best childcare option, your most reliable food gatherer during lean times, your community's memory of every disaster survived before, your primary teacher of hard-won survival skills, and often your only functioning peacekeeper all at once. That's not a small loss. That's the kind of loss that could genuinely determine whether a small band made it through the next bad year or didn't. It turns out the secret to humanity's survival wasn't just brawn or fire or even clever tools. It was something a lot less flashy and a lot more familiar. Some old person who had already made every possible mistake, survived every version of the crisis you're currently panicking about, and was more than happy to sit you down and explain, in exhaustive and occasionally repetitive detail, exactly how not to die. Turns out that's not annoying. That's the reason any of us are here to complain about it in the first place.